A Guten Erev Shabbos. Is there really such a thing as absolute evil? Does such a thing really exist? Something that's not redeemable, cannot repent and become something else? Are there really such people? A Gemara in Gittin claims that the grandchildren of Haman eventually went to study Torah in Bnei Brak. The sons of Korach, we know, wrote Psalms, which we read. Children of German Wehrmacht officers have converted to Judaism and moved to Israel. But that's the children. A few years ago, we had here in Shul someone who's a speaker who's a granddaughter of a commander of one of the camps. Some years ago, there was a libel trial in the United Kingdom. The trial took place there because the libel laws are different than in the US. In the United States, a person who's accusing libel has the burden of proof that what was written about them was libelous. In the UK, it's reversed. There, if a person accuses someone of libel, the writer has to prove that what they wrote was true. The issue at hand was Holocaust denial. A scholar from Emory University in Atlanta named Deborah Lipstadt, who's a leading Holocaust historian, called out a certain writer as a Holocaust denier in one of her books published in North America. Once it was published in the UK, the person took her and her publisher, Penguin Books, to court for libel, putting the burden of proof on her to substantiate what she had written. The long and the short of it is that with a team of lawyers and researchers, she presented a vast case of evidence that what she said was true, to the point where the judge issued a 349-page decision that upheld virtually every point that the defendants raised in the trial, and went beyond that to say that the plaintiff had been proven to be a racist and an apologist for the Nazi regime, in addition to being a willful falsifier of history. And the decision ordered the plaintiff to pay the court costs, which bankrupted him. I'll tell you the whole story to get to this quote. When recounting this trial after it ended, I heard Deborah Lipstadt speak about her experience, and she mentioned that there was at one point an offer to settle out of court, to which she responded, "This is absolute evil, and with absolute evil, there is no compromise." We want our language to be accurate and meaningful, and we are caught in the balance sometimes between that and our sympathy for humankind. It's pretty hard right now to feel much sympathy at all for Hamas. In fact, at the World Economic Forum in Davos this week in Switzerland, President Herzog walked back a bit of his prior endorsement of the much heralded two-state solution that everyone talks about. He said it's going to take a much clearer statement on the part of those he called my neighbors to be committed to the fight against terrorism and the kind of inhuman horrors inflicted on Israel and Israelis over the past 15 months, for there to be much enthusiasm anywhere in Israel for such a course of action. Of the many, many accusations made against rabbis, many of them true, few are more true than the accusation that we keep finding clues to the present in the stories of the past. First of all, guilty as charged. Second of all, who can say that there's nothing to be learned from history? There's a lot of insight and wisdom to be gleaned, which does not say that we have to blindly follow every pattern of the past. In fact, chas v'shalom, if anything, we're trying to break the patterns of the past in order to build a better future. Hopefully, if we study the stories of history, the mistakes of the past, maybe we can avoid repeating those very same mistakes. Probably we'll make new mistakes, but hopefully not just repeating the same old errors. It's very comforting and really helpful and empowering to know that we are not facing questions of evil, totalitarianism, dictatorship, and even murderous intent toward the Jewish nation against the better interests of the aggressor. For the very first time in history, history does have much to teach us about this. In order to do our best to ensure that our words retain their meaning, which is very important nowadays, as words quickly slip away from their meanings and come to mean anything, therefore they mean nothing, we should be very clear in our definition and not let one thing slide into another. Enslavement is not the same thing as genocide. Enslavement, like we experienced in Egypt, is the forced use of labor for the benefit of the enslaver. As awful and exploitive as this is, and it persisted in America, as you know, until the mid-1800s, and in fact to this very day around the world. Some estimates say that as many as 50 million people around the world today live in slavery, more than at any other time in human history. As inhumane as it is, it's still in the interest of the enslaver to keep the enslaved alive and in relative health and fitness. Contrast that with genocide, where the desire to exterminate and erase a people has murder as its highest value. The Holocaust was surely a hybrid of these two to some extent, and this week, on Monday, this coming week, on Monday, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the world will mark 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. It remains to be seen whether the Prime Minister of Israel will be allowed to attend those commemorations. Pharaoh is our paradigm of an enslaver. Pharaoh deliberately turns away from the part that Joseph had in sustaining the Egyptian economy and empire up to that point. In denying Yosef and his people's contribution, Pharaoh turns us into slaves. When Moshe and Aaron approach and ask in God's name that the Hebrews be set free, Pharaoh declines even to acknowledge that there is a God other than himself. As our portion opens this week, God specifically says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, Vani akshe es lev paro, which seems to block Pharaoh from changing his mind and having mercy on the Jews. And if indeed God did harden Pharaoh's heart and compel him to keep us in chains, then why should he or his people bear any punishment? Looks like they had no choice in the matter. The Ramban explains that through the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh was held accountable only for his enslavement of the people after hearing God's request to free us. Up to that point, that's all he was punished for. He decided on his own to remain obstinate. So at that point, things started to get worse for him. Really, this should not surprise us. Just as God helps those who help themselves, or the way we say it, the Gemara in Yuma says it, Haba letaher Messiah. So why should we be surprised if the dynamic works in the other direction? If someone decides to act willfully to harm others, enslave others, disempower others, why should God stand in the way of their choice, which they chose freely, or from suffering the consequences of those actions, being held responsible? How else will humankind learn from mistakes if there are no consequences to wrong actions? As those who make, let's say, morally good choices are helped, should not the same apply to those who choose morally poor courses? Should God try to stop them? That's not really free choice anymore, is it? The Meshech Chochmah wants to say that there's an important distinction with people like Pharaoh. The famous Rambam in the Laws of Divorce say that we can compel someone to give a get, a bill of divorce, until he says, I want to give a get, working on the assumption that deep down he really wants to do the right thing. Sometimes that pure essence, that inner gyroscope of correct choice gets clouded over and confused, and the person just needs a little help and encouragement to realize what their inner best self really wants to do. Pharaoh, however, seems evil to the core, says the Rav of Dvinsk. Even force, which would be successful with someone who deep down wants to do the right thing, cannot be effective here. In this case, it seems Pharaoh remains committed to the path that he's chosen for himself. Maimonides brings this example as a proof that for some individuals, the gates of repentance, the Sha'arei Tshuva, are closed. But that just leads us to another question. If Pharaoh's fate was sealed by his own choices, then why did Moshe keep appearing before him, offering a chance to change his course of action, relent on his stubbornness? Was it some kind of charade? To this, the Abarbanel offers an answer. There's really 2 kinds of tshuva. One is when someone offends God. If they realize the error of their ways, they can admit the error. They can say, I'm sorry, and promise to do better in the future. And God forgives. If, on the other hand, someone has harmed others, there is no tshuva for that person until they make up the damage that they've caused. You can't just say, oh, sorry about that, and go about your merry way. You really have to go back and repair the damage that you've done. That's something for us to think about in the Exodus context, and it gives us some perspective on the questions we face in our times. Aviva Zornberg goes a little bit deeper into the psychoanalysis of Pharaoh in a short essay on this parsha, which she titles The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Rashi quotes a midrash saying that Pharaoh went down to the Nile River every morning before anyone would see him to attend to his needs, relieve himself. He was trying to show his subjects that he was a god, so he had to appear superhuman. No one could see that he had a human need to eliminate, or to eat for that matter. In other words, he wanted to show that he had no needs, so also no vulnerability. Zornberg contrasts this with the Asher Yatzer bracha that we say. You can have a look on the wall in the hallway on the way to Kiddush, or on page 14 and 15 of your Siddur. We acknowledge and express our gratitude that our bodies function like human bodies are supposed to. With this, writes Aviva Zornberg, we give up any claim to immortality. We are human, very much so. Pharaoh's wish to be superhuman, to be godlike, is also his downfall. He doesn't listen. He won't take other views into account. He wants to remain unmoved and unmoving. His hubris is his own downfall, that of his country and his firstborns. Ultimately, because the destiny of the Jews is to go free, this is the only avenue of movement that remains. So when people ask that age-old riddle, is God so powerful that he can make a mountain so great that God himself cannot move it? I would always say, yes, a Jew. God creates us. And if we do not want to do something, we won't do it. Or if we want to do it, there's literally nothing that can stand in our way. And maybe that expands to Pharaoh too, or maybe this is the counterexample. Or maybe it depends if you're the central figure in the drama or a peripheral player. Pharaoh thought he was the center of the universe and he determined everything, till he learned the hard way that he wasn't, and he didn't. The story, as we understand it, is not about Pharaoh, it's about us. It's about our birth and development as a people. Part of that is Egypt and slavery, and part of that is about freedom. We were going forward, one way or the other. Pharaoh could help, or he could choose to stand in the way. He chose to stand in the way until he couldn't any longer, and he got swept up in the tide of history. And then later he had second thoughts and chased after us into the desert and into the sea. In 2 weeks you'll find out how well that went for Pharaoh and his legions and his chariots. Although Pharaoh hardened his heart, or God did, or God supported the choice Pharaoh made to harden his heart, he still could have chosen to go against the tide, to go against his worst inclination, to reach beyond himself and do the right thing. We believe God would have endorsed and helped that decision also. So it's good for us to keep in mind the famous saying from Burke: all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. This is a call to responsibility in our age, for compassion and for freedom. Hopefully, by the time you hear this, more of the hostages will be breathing the air of freedom in the embrace of their families, as we have been praying for from the depth of our hearts every day for 476 days. Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov. In Shul this week, we will bless the new month of Shvat, which begins on Thursday. The reappearance of the moon in Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, will take place on Wednesday morning at 6:17 with 17 parts. De Moilad wird sein Mittwoch in der Früh, 17 Minuten nach 6 Zeger mit 17 Chalakim. Rosh Chodesh wird sein Donnerstag, a good Shabbos, a good Chodesh.